The setting for last week's scripture was a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. You might remember that after a long day of teaching, Jesus asked his disciples to take him across the lake, which is what the Sea of Galilee is, a big freshwater lake, to the other side. And then he proceeded to fall asleep in the bow of the boat because he was tired, even though they encountered a giant storm in the middle of their trip. When the disciples woke Jesus up in a panic, he calmed the storm and asked them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" The setting for this week's tough question from Jesus is almost identical. And that's actually a kind of a coincidence. Maybe it's providence, but I don't know that we were looking at that when we picked these texts. So once again, we find Jesus with his disciples in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, only this time there's no storm. The one thing that remains consistent between last week's story and this one is the disciples' misunderstanding and the disciples' confusion. Apparently, during the time between that first boat trip and this one, the disciples really hadn't learned a whole lot. So when Jesus addresses them this time, following their misunderstanding and confusion, it isn't just with one tough question, but with a whole barrage of questions. I think that's the best way to describe it, is a barrage of questions. In Mark 8, verses 14 through 21, which is our text, Jesus asks the disciples a total of 9 questions in 8 verses. That's a lot of questions in just a short space of time, which is why we have all of these question marks on the board instead of a question, because we couldn't fit all of the questions in one spot today. To say Jesus was a little bit worked up might be an understatement. But when you read the whole chapter, it's kind of easy to understand why. So Mark begins chapter 8 with the story of the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, which is when Jesus fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread. A few weeks before that, Jesus fed 5,000 people. This is probably the more familiar story. He fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The disciples were present for both of those miracles. So they witnessed those miracles firsthand. And it appears from chapter 8 of Mark that there were some Pharisees present for the feeding of the 4,000. And the reason we know that is because immediately following the miracle, Mark tells us that some Pharisees approached Jesus and they demanded that he give them a sign. They wanted to know for sure that he was the Messiah. Apparently, the miracle that they just witnessed wasn't enough. They wanted more than that. Even though the Pharisees had seen Jesus heal the sick and had been critical of him for that too, and even though they'd seen him feed thousands of people with a few loaves of bread, it didn't matter. Their minds were already made up. And so Mark describes that encounter in these verses, 11 through 13 of that chapter. The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. Now, I love where it says Jesus sighed deeply. I think we've all felt that way before. It's a kind of a bone-deep weariness, right? He knew there was nothing he could do that was going to convince those Pharisees he was the Messiah. And he knew it. And I think he was probably frustrated. It's no wonder he continued to think about that conversation afterwards. And I think he did. I think he continued to think about that encounter. Have you ever had a difficult conversation or an argument with someone, and then it just kind of keeps replaying in your mind? I imagine that argument with the Pharisees was like that for Jesus. The very people who should have been most receptive to Jesus, These were the experts in the law. They knew God's story going all the way back to Genesis. They were a part of God's covenant. They were His teachers, right? They should have been the most receptive to Him, and yet they were the ones who seemed to be fighting Him every step of the way. And as we're going to see in our story, as the story continues, His disciples weren't much better. So we pick up the story in verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, "Watch out. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." And then the disciples said to one another, "It is because we have no bread." And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, "Why are you talking about having bread? Do you not still perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Mark starts off this part of the chapter by basically just stating the facts, right? Just describing the situation. Even though the disciples had managed to collect 7 baskets full of leftover pieces of bread after the feeding of the 4,000, they only remembered to bring 1 loaf with them in the boat, which is not really that big of a deal, right? He's just reporting what happened. Wasn't a big deal, but for some reason, it's all that the disciples could think about. I don't know if they were hungry or what, but it's all they could think about. Jesus' mind, however, I'm convinced, was still on that encounter he'd had with the Pharisees. He was still thinking about it, and he thought, you know what? I need to say something to them about those guys, about those religious leaders. And so he warned them. He said, "Beware the yeast of the Pharisees, and beware the yeast of Herod." Now, he had seen the corrupting power of institutional religion, and he was setting himself apart from that, right? He'd seen the pride of the scribes and the Pharisees, who were all about ritual, who were all about following even the smallest details of the law, but who missed the bigger picture, the more important stuff, the fundamental stuff about love and justice and peace. He sometimes described them as whitewashed tombs, which I think is a great metaphor, isn't it? They look great, beautiful, clean on the outside, but inside they were filled with corruption and filth and death. They were all talk. Jesus had also seen the corrupting influence of political power. And I think that's what he's talking about when he mentions King Herod and the yeast of Herod. Herod, like Pontius Pilate and some of the other politicians that were connected to the temple who were in Jerusalem, they all had a direct connection to Rome and to the political power of Rome, and that was significant. They were all about collecting as much money and as much power for themselves and their friends as possible. So when Jesus says, "Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and beware the yeast of Herod," that's what he's talking about. He's saying to his disciples, those are both ways of living and seeing the world that will corrupt you from the inside out. Like yeast in bread dough, it will change you through and through, every part of you, if you're not careful. So watch out, he says, beware. Sitting in my study 2,000 years later, it seems pretty clear to me that that's what Jesus was saying. But obviously the disciples didn't get it. In fact, the way Mark describes it, they were almost comical in their cluelessness. Jesus was trying to communicate this important spiritual truth, and all they could think about was bread. They said to each other, "He's talking about yeast? I think it's because we didn't bring enough bread with us to eat." Right? That's what he's saying. So Jesus is talking about one thing, and his disciples are talking about something else entirely. And it reminded me, I remembered something that happened when my boys were little. And they came to me with a disagreement. And I have no idea what they were fighting about now. But they wanted me to be the judge. And sometimes that's what we do for our kids. So I heard them out, and I gave them my verdict. I said, this was my exact words, I said, well, based on what I just heard, I think Ryan was more wrong than Joel. Okay? So I was offering a verdict in favor of the younger brother. Well, at that point, Ryan, the older brother, burst into tears, and he was way, way angrier than I think he had any right to be. And I'm like, why are you so mad? What's up? And he said, well, you didn't have to call me a moron. I was like, what? And he said, you called me a moron. And I said, no, I said, you were more wrong than Joel, is what I said. You see where he got that. Jesus warned the disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, and all they could think about was that yeast makes bread, and they'd forgotten to bring enough for everybody to eat. So when Jesus heard them talking about that, you can imagine, he heard them talking about that, he realized exactly how far they'd missed the mark, and that's when he lets loose with the questions. 9 questions in a row. Boom, boom, boom. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Do you not yet understand? The disciples had completely missed the point. In some ways, they weren't that much different than the Pharisees, right? Who also failed to understand. But that's what makes this such a great story. That's why I love it. Jesus warned the disciples because they misunderstood, just like we do. We were talking about this on Wednesday night at our life group. If all of the disciples were perfect, if they never made a mistake, if they never misunderstood Jesus, it'd be really hard for us to relate, I think. But when we see how even the ones who were with him messed things up and misunderstood, it's a whole lot easier for us to see ourselves in the story. That's what makes the Bible so valuable to us. It's not just their story. It's our story. Exactly. Sometimes we just need a little help to understand. Sometimes we need Jesus to shake us up a little bit. It's like the man who went into a bank, said he needed to get some money, and the teller explained to him he needed to fill out a check, and he needed to sign it, but the man wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. The teller said, if you won't sign the check, I can't give you any money. So he turned around and he said, well, I'll just take my business elsewhere. And he went across the street to another bank, and he wound up having the exact same conversation with the teller at that bank, but this teller was a little bit more hands-on. And so when the man failed to listen to what he needed to do, the teller reached across the counter, grabbed him by the ears, and banged his head on the counter 3 times. Then the man took out a pen and calmly signed a check and withdrew some money. After he got his money, he went back to the first bank, and he said to the first teller, he said, they gave me money across the street at that bank. And the first teller said, well, how did that happen? And he said, he explained it to me. Jesus didn't take anyone by the ears that day in the boat. But I think based on the questions that he asked, I think he might have felt like taking them by the ears. And I think his questions were the verbal equivalent of that. Bang, 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 bang. One after another. Do you not understand? Do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? He needed to get their attention, and sometimes he needs to get our attention as well. The fact is, we have something in common both with the Pharisees and the first disciples. We have access to the miracles. We have access to Jesus' teachings. We may not get to witness it firsthand like they did, but we have the whole story written down for us in the New Testament. Some of us have been studying that story, and those stories our entire lives, and yet sometimes we act as if we have no idea what Jesus is talking about. In our scripture reading, that misunderstanding, at least on this particular day, began when Jesus said, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." So let's go back to that. What does that mean to us today? We know he wasn't talking about bread. So what does it mean to us now? Well, I think it means the same thing to us now as it did then. First of all, don't let toxic religion influence you. Don't be like the Pharisees. That's what he's saying. Don't be like the Pharisees. Don't say one thing and do another. That's simple. Don't be more concerned about your Christian reputation than you are about what's really going on in your heart and in your mind. That's way more important than what people think. And if you suddenly, this is the big one, I think. If you suddenly wake up one day and realize that God just happens to hate all the people you hate, that's the yeast of the Pharisees, people. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Watch out for it. That's what he's saying. It will change you, just like yeast does. Likewise, don't let toxic politics influence you either. Don't be like Herod and the Sadducees and Pontius Pilate and all of those other politicians in Jerusalem. If you spend all your day absorbing angry political rhetoric, I don't care where it comes from, it can come from the left, the middle, and the right, wherever it comes from, if that's all you're absorbing all day, every day, that's the yeast of Herod. If you think it's your job to argue with strangers on the internet or to wreck every family meal you go to with political talk, that's the yeast of Herod. It's the yeast of a culture that sometimes talks a good game. That's the thing. Sometimes it looks okay. It sometimes talks a good game, like the Pharisees, but in the end, it doesn't really want anything to do with the real Jesus. Not really. And don't pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about, because I know you do. We all know there are powerful forces at work in the world and in our culture that want to shape us and control us from the inside out, just like yeast works in bread dough. But the good news, thank God there's some good news, and I always try to finish with that. The good news is that our faith can and does work the exact same way. In fact, Jesus used the image of yeast not just as a metaphor for evil, which is what the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod is. He also used it as a metaphor for good. He once said, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. That's how it works. That's how God works. When we surrender our lives to God, we change. We might not get things right 100% of the time after that, but when we decide to follow Jesus, something fundamental about us changes. We become new, almost at the cellular level. Our past no longer defines us. As the Apostle Paul said, and he understood this better than anybody, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And even better, when that happens, we also become change agents in the world. We become like yeast. All right? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus used a similar metaphor. He said, as disciples, we are to be like salt and light. How do those work? Right? Put in a little bit of salt, it changes the composition of anything to which it's added. You go into a pitch black room where you can't see your hand in front of your face, a little bit of light changes everything. It allows those who live in darkness to see. When we surrender our lives to Jesus and seek to live according to His teaching, really listen, really hear, really see and understand, God changes us from the inside out. And when that happens, we don't have to be loud. We don't have to be controlling. We don't have to argue with people. we simply become like a little bit of salt, like a little bit of light, like a little bit of yeast, and we change our families, and we change our communities, and we change our workplaces, and we change our world. I'm convinced that's how spiritual revival begins in the world. A lot of talk right now about revival, and I love it because I think we've been experiencing it here. That's how revival begins, not with a lot of noise, but with changed hearts, with changed lives. So, let me ask, do you hear and understand? Do you have eyes and see? Jesus asks us tough questions like that because he loves us. He asks us tough questions because he wants us to grow and he wants us to thrive. So I'm going to finish my sermon and this entire series with one final question. And it may be the simplest but the toughest question of them all. How will you respond?